Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aline Churamoff, and I'm Senior Vice President of Community Development and Engagement here at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. And I'm pleased to welcome you all to our virtual convening centered on a new data tool on residential moves in our market. Housing and housing affordability are central to the well-being of every American, but in particular, we're focused on understanding the economic well-being of low to moderate income communities across our district, and that's really central to our mandate. Understanding people's residential choices and movement patterns across the Twin Cities metro gives us insight into how local economies are shifting and how people are navigating housing markets. Housing and where we live shapes our access to economic opportunities. This data tool that Tyler Boesch will explain in a minute offers a unique opportunity to explore migration trends in our district. He'll also give a brief tutorial on what you all can do with the different views on the dashboard. He'll show you how you can use our tool to see how the flow of people into and out of the metro communities has changed over time. He'll also explain how you can filter the tool and look at some specific groups that the data allow us to identify. In the second half of our conversation, Senior Policy Analyst Ben Horowitz will talk about some of the initial research that we've done with the data. For example, we've used the data to compare movement patterns into and out of neighborhoods with different demographic and income profiles. I want to thank you all for tuning in. We look forward to sharing more of our research on housing and migration with you in the future. With that, I'll turn it over to Tyler.
Thank you, Aline. To begin, I just want to mention that the views expressed here are the presenters and not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis or the Federal Reserve System. Next slide, please. And with that, I just want to provide a little bit more detail about the data underlying the tool that Aline was alluding to. The data that we use in the Metro Migration Dashboard are called the Consumer Credit Panel. And these data come from a partnership between the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and Equifax. And what the data are is a 5% sample, nationally representative sample of everybody with a social security number and a credit report. So if you take a look at all the folks on the left and think of that as the population that has both a social security number and a credit report, we have data on those last 5 blue individuals that are circled, and that group is representative of the population as a whole. Now, for that representative sample, we have information really on anything that goes into one's credit report. Think all the different lines of credit that individuals have open, the types of credit, perhaps a mortgage or an auto loan, things like this. We know an individual's credit score, and even if they have overdue balances on their credit lines. We also have information about an individual's age, as well as their anonymized address, which allows us to attach them to a geographic, a census block, which is the lowest level geography offered by the census. Now, importantly, in contrast to some other survey data that you all might be used to using, we don't have certain demographic information about these individuals. For example, we don't have access to their race or their ethnicity or their income group, amongst other things. Next slide, please. That being said, I really want to emphasize that the CCP, the Consumer Credit Panel, provides users of the dashboard and policymakers with really unprecedented frequency and geographic granularity when it comes to understanding migration trends in the metropolitan area. And I think that this comes through most clearly when you compare the CCP to 2 other commonly used data sources for generating migration statistics, those being the American Community Survey, as well as data from the Internal Revenue Service. Now, looking at the sample across those 3 data sets, the American Community Survey has the broadest sample, looking at a nationally representative sample of American households. The IRS is more specific with their data. It looks only at individuals who file an income tax return. And the Consumer Credit Panel, again, has a nationally representative sample of those with both a credit report and a social security number. Now, it's really with the frequency of the data and the geographic granularity of the data that the CCP stands apart from these other sources. The CCP is updated quarterly, as opposed to annually in the case of the IRS and the 1 and 5 year versions of the ACS. And we again have information at the census block level, though for our research and analysis, we tend to focus on the census tract or above. Meanwhile, the IRS is just at the county level, and the ACS does provide some information at the census tract level, but we aren't able to see, for example, what share of X census tract moves to Y census tract in the same way that we can with the CCP. Finally, the other variables that are included in the data set do differ. As I mentioned, the CCP doesn't have much demographic information, but it has a real wealth of credit information on the individuals included in the sample. Meanwhile, the IRS only provides age and income categories, and the ACS does offer a breadth of socioeconomic and demographic characteristics, but at the expense of frequency and geographic granularity. Next slide, please. And so with that, with that context of the data, I want to dive into the dashboard itself and highlight some of the key use cases that we're hoping users and policymakers take advantage of. The first being the destination map. And for the map, what users will be able to do is select a city in the metropolitan area, or if you're in St. Paul or Minneapolis, you can select a specific community and then specify a start year and an end year. And when you update the map, a little card in the upper right-hand corner of the screen, as you see, will generate various migration outcomes for residents of that geography between the time frames. So to make that more clear, here I've chosen the Longfellow community of Minneapolis between 2019 and 2023. And we see that the share of 2019 Longfellow residents by 2023, it varied by a variety of geographic possibilities. About 68% of 2019 Longfellow residents stayed in Longfellow by 2023. Roughly 6.5% moved to other areas of Minneapolis. Around 3% moved to St. Paul. 9% roughly moved to a suburb within the metro. And then about 6.5% of 2019 Longfellow residents did not live in the metropolitan area by 2023. And we can get even more specific than that for those who did move and where they moved to. The tooltip that you see on the screen exemplifies this, where we show of 2019 Longfellow residents who moved, about 1.4% moved to Woodbury by 2023. And as you hovered across different geographies on the screen, you would see that tooltip update to show the share of movers who ended up in a different geography. Next slide, please. We also can basically use this same concept, but flipped on its head with the origin map and see where residents of particular geographies are coming from. So using the same selections, Longfellow between 2019 and 2023, we can see what share of 2023 Longfellow residents came from different geographic origins. Again, from Longfellow, essentially those who did not move, those who have been there for 4 years, those coming from other parts of Minneapolis, St. Paul, a suburb within the metro, or those who moved to Longfellow from outside of the metropolitan area. Once again, we can get, for movers, even more specific. And as you're hovering over the screen, you can see for different geographies, the share of movers coming from a given place. So I've shown here that 3.9% of 2023 Longfellow residents actually lived in Southwest Minneapolis in 2019. So this is really a level of geographic specificity that is unavailable with any other widely used data set. And it's really unique to be able to offer this granularity with the CCP. Next slide, please. The next feature I really want to highlight is the flow diagram in the Metro Migration Dashboard. And this takes advantage of the panel aspect of the CCP, meaning that we can follow the same individuals across multiple periods of time. And so to begin, the user will select 3 time points. Here I've just shown 2014, 2019, and 2023. And we can trace the migration outcomes for all individuals across those 3 time points. So in the first period between 2014 and 2019, we see that the majority of individuals actually stayed in their tracks. By our definition, they did not move. We see a slightly smaller share of individuals who did move tracks, but they remained in the metro. And then we see, as I've highlighted here with the tooltip, about 9% of 2014 metropolitan area residents moved out of the metro by 2019. From there, we can look at those same groups and look at the period between 2019 and 2023 and see how they further moved or stayed in place. So for those who initially stayed in their tract, some of them again just stayed in their tract, they did not move, while some moved out of the metro and others moved within the metro. For those who initially moved within the metro, some folks stayed in place, while some moved again within the metro or left the metro entirely. Finally, for those who initially moved out of the metro, the vast majority stayed outside of the metropolitan area, whereas there is a small portion of those who did return to the metro by 2023. So this type of diagram is really unique to the panel feature that the CCP offers. Next slide, please. And finally, we wanted to provide users with longer run trends of common migration outcomes so that you can both get the really specific, the really local understanding and lens of migration trends, and then also understand at a higher level how these sorts of trends are changing over time. So what we have here is the user can select a variety of metrics, which are common migration statistics, such as the net migration rate, the crude migration rate, and the in and out migration rates for the metropolitan area. And they can disaggregate that further by different age groups, credit score groups, and the mortgage status of those individuals, and trace for those groups how these trends have changed over time. To just provide an example, I've showed the net migration rate for everybody over the period of 2006 to 2023. And I just want to point out a trend that I found interesting as I was looking at these data, that the net migration rate has decreased beginning from just before the pandemic to present. We've seen a little bit of a rebound between 2022 and 2023. But that initial period between 2019 and 2022, we see the out-migration increasingly outpacing the in-migration, which is resulting in a declining net migration rate. Again, we see that the difference between out and in migration isn't quite as severe between 2022 and 2023. We see an uptick in that rate, but nonetheless, out migration is still larger than in migration, resulting in a negative net migration rate. So this will be interesting to track and see how it changes over time, if we continue to see this rebound as time goes on, or if the Twin Cities will continue to see this negative net migration rate. Now, I do want to specify that from our data, we are looking at domestic migration. So there is international migration, obviously, we know about the Twin Cities, that is not captured here due to our data restrictions. But nonetheless, I think that this is going to provide a really interesting and important long-run trend and understanding of migration for those who are using our data. With that, I want to transition over to my colleague, Ben Horowitz, who's going to speak to some other analysis on migration in Minnesota that our team has done using these data.
Thanks, Tyler, and thanks for that great overview of this tool and all the things that users can do with it. I also want to pause briefly to thank Kim and Key, who contributed a lot to this project and is not part of the presenters today. Like Tyler said, I'm going to talk about some additional analyses we've created as we were working with this data, getting it ready for users such as yourselves. You can find all of the charts that I'm presenting in my slides today in our companion article to the piece, or rather to the dashboard that was posted on Minneapolis-Fed.org, and there are also a few additional angles presented there. We're also looking to continue our work with this data, so we're very open to hearing from all of you, whether you're watching this live or recorded, for more ideas on questions we might ask. With that, I'll turn to one of the first things we did, which was to separate all of the individuals in the data into different credit score bands based on work with similar sets of data and even the same data around the country. We then looked at migration patterns during different periods of history with the years we have available to us. So here you can see what migration has looked like during the 3 years of the COVID era, beginning in 2020 through 2023. And what really jumped out in this cut to me was the fact that the people with the highest credit scores and the lowest credit scores were the two groups that were least likely to move. Now, credit scores are not a perfect correlate with income. We do know that people with higher credit scores do tend to have higher income, so we want to use some caution here. But this is still a very interesting finding, and one that I might not have expected heading into the analysis. When we look further back in time and compare the COVID years to another era when there was quite a bit of disruption in the housing market and in people's lives in general, during the Great Recession period from 2005 to 2011, you see quite a different story, where there was a large difference between the migration rates for people with the highest credit scores and people with the lowest credit scores or no credit scores at all. You don't need to be an economist at the Fed to note that we're comparing a 6-year period to a 3-year period. So of course, there's bound to be some important distinctions there, but nevertheless, this is something that sort of holds interest as you look at the intervening years as well. In our article, you can see the same charts for 2012 to 2015 and 2016 to 2019. And you see that COVID differs from those time periods in a similar fashion, in that the lower credit score and higher credit score categories tended to have larger gaps than we've seen in the last 3 years. As Tyler mentioned, we can't see people's income, race, or other characteristics that we might like to provide some analysis on. However, we can still compare at a geographic level the types of neighborhoods people are living in and how that correlates with people's migration habits. So we did that in 2 ways in the article. First, we looked at median household incomes by tract, and then we grouped those and plotted them along the x-axis in terms of where their median household income sits, and then on the y-axis what the out-migration rate was during the years 2020 to 2023. You can see there's a pretty interesting relationship between the income level in a census tract and the rate at which people were leaving that census tract during this time period that starts to level off right around $80,000, $90,000. And if you go to the article, you can see there's also a relationship between the share of people in a census tract who are people of color and the out-migration rates, where tracts with more people of color saw higher migration rates. We're also hoping to learn more about where people move when they leave a census tract. So repeating the grouping shown in this chart in some ways, we looked at census tracts within different income categories. These income categories are based on the Community Reinvestment Act, or the CRA. So low-income tracts are those with 0 to 50% of an area's median income. Moderate income tracts are those with 50 to 80% of an area's median income. Middle income tracts are 80 to 120%, and high income those with 120% or greater of an area's median income as their median income. And you can see from this illustration that there's quite a bit of movement across census tracts in terms of their income category. I want to note, as we do in the article, that the left side of this chart is not weighted in any way by share of tracts within the region. So, for example, low-income tracts make up about 1 in 8 of the census tracts within the metro region we're looking at. And about 20% of people who lived in low-income tracts moved to another low-income tract. So still more likely to move within the same tract category than they would be if it was sort of randomly distributed. But nevertheless, these patterns seem interesting and worthy of further consideration as we continue to dig into this rich data set. With that, we've given you a sense of how the data works that underlie the dashboard and some of the first questions we've been considering, where our brains are headed as we hope to do further research. And I will pause now and take a look at what questions have been dropped into the chat. Looks like we do not have any open questions. I think Tyler answered Santiago's question in the chat, the paper providing a bit more background. So with that, I encourage you all to take some time to explore this data, and please don't hesitate to be in touch with any questions you might come up with later. Thanks a lot for sharing your time with us today.